Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is the final of a three-part series where we've been looking at codes in Donman. In the first webinar 2 or 3 months ago, we looked at the codes on the donor screen, what they meant, how to add them or update the list, and where on the menus that you can do that. In last month's webinar, we discussed the best practices for coding donors to make data selection easier, i.e. to make your job a lot easier when you come to pull out lists of donors. We also looked at how to run bulk code updates if or when you actually decided you needed to change your coding system. So today we're going to look at some of the other codes that are used throughout Donman that principally exist in the codes file. Most of the codes or things that we call codes in Donman exist in the code file, and once you know how to update one of those, then essentially you know how to update the rest of those in the codes file. So I would say maybe 90 to 95% of codes are actually in that file. And in the first webinar that we did in the series, we looked at how to do that for those specific codes on the donor record. Please note that there are some other things that we call codes that don't exist in the codes file, and some of those things are things like, for instance, the campaign codes, and we've done webinars on campaign codes before, but they are in their separate file called the campaign file. There are in memoriam relative codes, and again they're in a separate file called the relative file. Function master codes exist in the function master file, sorry. The postcode suburb codes are separate again, and we'll actually have a bit of a look at how to update those today. Relationship codes, again, are in their separate file, but we will look at that today. And then we've got things like bank account codes and bequest solicitor codes, and there are a few other codes that do exist. And most of those have been covered in previous webinars. We're going to begin by looking at a thing called the donation type. Now, this is a very useful code, but one that not everyone is actually aware of, but is part of the base system and therefore is available to everyone to be able to make use of. I'll just explain exactly how it came into effect. We used to have an organization that advertised their appeals in 20 different church-based magazines. It cost them money to do that, so they were keen to determine how much money was raised from each magazine and compare that to the amount of money that they spent on the advertisements. Before the donation type field was available to them, they had to create one campaign for each magazine for each appeal. At the time that they did that, there was no opportunity to actually duplicate campaigns, so every time they ran an appeal, they had to create 20 separate campaigns, each of those from scratch. After a couple of years, they had amassed 160 campaigns just for appeals because they ran 4 appeals a year. If they wanted to analyze, say, a year's worth of data for those magazines, what they had to do is for each magazine, they had to total up 4 separate campaigns. And that obviously was a bit of a pain and was quite unwieldy. What we did for them is we wrote this option here called donation type. And that allowed them to, when they ran their first appeal with this option, all they needed to do was create one campaign and set up 20 codes, donation type codes, which they called coupon codes. And so once they had done that, when they entered a donation, they would all go to the one campaign, but they would then be able to choose the coupon code or donation type code for that particular that coupon that came in. In subsequent appeals, all they needed to do is create a new campaign. So what I'm going to have a look at now is how do we actually set this up? So if I can swap to my Donman system here. In order to set it up, first of all, we need to turn it on. And we do that by simply going into System Defaults. Now, we get there generally by going from the Start menu to the Main menu. We go into your system name, whatever yours happens to be, Fundraising, and then Modify History, Archive menu, and hopefully you know the password. For those that don't, it's danger. So the option we're going into is this one here called Modify System Defaults. This is where we specify how we want Donman to react in certain situations. And one of those options is when we go to the second screen by pressing F2, down at the bottom here, you've got this question that says, use donation type field, yes or no. So I've already got this turned on, but if you're not using it, yours would be a no. You can simply set that to a yes, and then you can give it a name on the screen. So just like you can rename some of the fields on the donor record, we can also rename this donation type field, and I've called it here $source. That organization that we initially implemented this for, they would have put the word coupon there so that when they process a donation, it would be asking for their coupon. You can, if you like, specify a default value so that all donations will initially come up with a particular donation type. Otherwise, you can just leave it blank. If I click on the ... you can see the sorts of things I've got in there at the moment. Now, $source, as I've got here, the idea of this, and this is used quite a lot by some of our clients, is that you can actually nominate where or how you acquired that donation. On the donor record itself, there is a donor source code to say, how did we acquire this donor? Well, if you want, you can use this donation type field to say, how did we acquire this donation? So if we have a look at the list of options there, you could see I've got one there for the Age newspaper. That's a Melbourne-based one. There's one here to say that it's a response to a direct mail out or a response to an email. Maybe they've given at an event. You might have had a ball and people have been making donations there. I've got one for the Herald Sun, which again is another newspaper, maybe TV advertisements. It's always good to have one called unknown in case you don't know what it is, although you could optionally just leave it blank if you didn't know. Walking off the street. And another popular way of acquiring donations is this web donations. So if you have a web page and you're downloading the donations and importing those, you could give them a donation type of web. If you want to force people to always put something in, you'd make sure that there is no blank donation type, and then they would have to put something in there. Okay, so this is where we set it up, and once we've done that, we can just enter through and we've saved that. Now, the next thing that we need to do is actually set it up with those codes. Now, I've already done that, but the place to do that is on your campaign setup menu. So I can either go into the main menu here and use campaign setup, or in my case, I've actually set up this user button here to be campaign setup, so I can go straight there from there. And you can see here, I've got add, edit, donation type codes. So when I go into there, again, I'm going to see the same options that I had before, but now I can actually add to this, I can change those. So if I decided that I didn't want to allow people to leave it blank, I can call that up. Now, if you recall from our first webinar in the series, you can't just select it by pressing enter on it, but if I press F3, which is find, I've now brought up that blank code, and Shift F6 will now delete that, and when I look at my drop-down list, it's no longer there. If I wanted to add another one from a blank screen, I could just type in Murray or something in Murray's donations, excuse me, and that has now added that to the list. There it is, Murray. And to delete that, I can just pull it up and delete. Okay, so once you've actually got those codes set up, the next thing is to see how that actually gets used. So the place that this gets used is when we're doing donation entry. Essentially, this field will end up on the donation records when you run those through end of day update. So I'm going to go into donation processing, record donations, and I'll say, yes, I want to record a new batch. I'll just put in one donation for $1. Okay, so I'll choose my donor and I'll just use donor number 1, Johnny Be Good. When I come to the third screen, I'll put my donation in, $1, one part. I'll say that it's cash, yes to bank. I'll say yes to receipt. Now, you see where we are at the moment. We've got this $source. So this is our donation type field. We've renamed it on the screen to $source. And when I look at the options there, you can see what they are. Now, because I deleted the blank, if I try and leave that blank, it's going to say there's no such code. So it's now forcing me to say, how did we acquire this donation? And I'll say maybe that came as a result of a direct mail out. And then obviously I can complete the campaign. Well, I don't know what campaigns I've got here, but I could complete that donation and that would go through. When you're downloading donations from the web, you also have the ability to add a donor type, and I think also for the peer-to-peer options, you have the same facility as well. I won't bother to continue with that. Now, as well as writing that facility, we also added a new report to get a breakdown on that. And we can find that simply in the, let's see, that's reports, and then in the campaign reports menu, we should have this one here called Donation Type Breakdown Report. So when we go in there, it's using the dollar source, the renamed thing that we had. We could, if we want, specify just a particular code, or we can leave that and say, yes, we want all codes. We can select or exclude by campaign or campaign name. We can do a date range. So I'll just do from the beginning of last year, because that's where I've got my donations. I can get a grand total only, but that's pretty useless. Rather than getting every single donation, though, for each source code, I'll just say I want a total. And I don't want, well, I'll say, yeah, give me the GST, and then I'll just do a print preview. Now, you'll also notice down here, it's creating a text file. So if you wanted to import the raw data, there's text, you could do that by looking at this file here in the report text subdirectory under your DM work directory. Let me do the print preview. Okay. So basically now, because I've deleted that blank code, there are quite a lot of donations which have that blank, but it's not there. Had I left that in there, it just would have said no code or something along those lines. But here now you can see all the different codes that are actually being used, how much money they've raised, how many donations. So if we were actually trying to do, compare that to the cost of each magazine or each of those different methods of importing, we could then see just what the value of those donations was. So that is a very useful feature that a lot of people are unaware of, simply because if they haven't turned it on, they're not actually going to see it on their donation entry screen. It could also be used for other reasons. Sometimes people, when they're slicing and dicing and analyzing their donations, they have their chart of accounts ledger code, but sometimes they might want something like a project code. So they might have a series of maybe 10 or 20 different ledger codes, but there are maybe 10 or 20 different projects. Now, rather than trying to create maybe 400 different combinations of the project code and the account code, if they use donation type as the project code and the account code is just the ledger code there, then they can actually slice it and dice it and split it up in any way that they wanted to. All right, so that's all I'm going to say now on donation type, but yes, that's a very useful feature. The next thing that we're going to have a look at is the postcode suburb file. Now, this is one of those files that doesn't exist within the actual codes file. So what we'll do is we'll go into housekeeping. Now, when we go into that, when you enter a new donor or update their suburb, you need to make sure that the suburb, state, and postcode actually go together as entries from this postcode suburb file. If you try to put in a combination that doesn't exist, in years gone past, you used to be able to add that on the fly as you're processing that donor record. But the trouble with that was that there were too many misspellings, typos, and things where maybe they put MT instead of mount, and so they couldn't find it. So now there are two entries for the one suburb. So nowadays, you can't add those yourself while you're entering a donor record. The only one that you can enter is if you set up a postcode called unknown. It will actually let you do that on the fly, but anything else, you'll need to come here. So what you might find is over time, there may be postcodes, new postcodes or suburbs that pop up in new areas, or there may be combinations where it's perhaps not valid, but you still want to add it. as an example, you might have somebody who lives in Prahran in Victoria, which used to be a low socio-economic area, but it's actually going up market quite a lot these days. But right next to it is South Yarra and Toorak. So there may be people who live close to the border of South Yarra, but not quite. They like to say that they live in South Yarra, but in order to get their mail, they actually have to put the postcode for Prahran. So in order to add those, what we can do is we go into here. So if I knew what the postcode for Prahran was, I could look it up there. But let me use a different example. Let's say there's a new suburb. I'm going to call it Murrayville. And it's the same postcode as 1234. I can add that, but if I'm not really sure of, say, this bulk mail code or the mail center code, all I need to do is press F3. That's brought up the first of those records for 1234 as a postcode, and if I page down, it is the only one at the moment with that postcode. But you can see here that the bulk mail code is 15. So if I put another suburb in under the same postcode, it will have the same mail code. So if I clear the screen, I'll just type in 1234. I'll make up my fictitious name here, Murrayville. And I'll give it 15, and of course that's in New South Wales. And enter to save, and that's now there. So we can do anything along those lines. We can't, unfortunately, do a drop down here. So if you wanted to actually look and see what suburbs were there, you could generate a report perhaps in VisRep, or even if you're on a donor record, if I go to Start Menu, Donor Entry, I'll just bring up the first person, but if I click, say, on the suburb field, you can see I can get a list of all the different ones in a page at a time, but at least I can see, or I can sort that by postcode and see what postcodes are in a particular area. If I go back to where I was, which is under housekeeping again, postcode suburb file edit, and I'm looking up 1234, if I page down through them, you can see, I can see all the postcodes that are in there, just working my way through those. And if ever there was one you wanted to delete, so let's say I want to delete my 1234 again, I just do a find, page down to the one I want to delete, that's the one. And like pretty much everything else in Donman, when you want to delete a code, it's simply a matter of pressing Shift F6. All right, so that's the postcode suburb file. It may well be worth your while at some stage generating a very simple report in Visual Reporter on all records in the postcode suburb file. It should be a fairly simple thing to do, but if you need some help, we can probably just provide one for you. The next thing that I'd like to have a look at is relationship codes. Now, we can relate donor records for a relationship. So if there's a husband and a wife, father, children, etc., we can put those relationships in. If you want to use soft credit, then there needs to be a relationship between two people. So if I'm doing a walkathon and somebody is wanting to sponsor me, they make the donation. So the donation goes in under their name, but if they soft credit it to me, then when somebody looks at my record, they can see, well, he hasn't given us any money, but he's been soft credited with $1,000 worth of donations. So that means that I've effectively helped to raise $1,000 of donations, even though I didn't actually give any of that myself necessarily. So in order for soft credit, there needs to be that relationship. Now, if you're using any of the peer-to-peer modules, like Everyday Hero, MyCause, or Go Fundraise, when you import those donations, you can get it to automatically create a relationship between the donor and the fundraiser. And so those sorts of relationships would then have to be set up in the system before you can use it. So to do that, we can go into housekeeping, and like a lot of the codes that are used on the actual donor screen itself or donor record, we go into donor descriptive codes. And somewhere on here, if I can find it, we should have relationship. There it is over there. Now, as I said, this is again one of those codes that don't actually exist in the codes file itself. It's in its own separate file. Now, I don't have, well, let me have a look here. I shouldn't have one there for sponsor or donor. So there's nothing there for sponsor. So if I want to say somebody is the sponsor of somebody, I can create a code called sponsor, and the description is, just sponsor. Now, we need to put in the reverse relationship. So when I say this person is the sponsor, person A is the sponsor of person B, there needs to be the equal and opposite relationship from person B back to person A. Now, you can have it different for males and females. So if the code was father, the opposite for females would be daughter, and the opposite for males would be son. In the case of sponsor, that's gender neutral. So the opposite for females would be something like fundraiser, or I might just call it hero, and the same thing would apply for males. Now, obviously, I haven't created a code for hero yet, so this will actually allow me to do that. Now that I've done it, I can create the opposite relationship, which is hero, and I'll just call it fundraiser here. And the opposite is sponsor. And if I actually look at the drop-down list, we should be able to see that sponsor is in there. So I can pick it either way. So now that I've got that, I can now go into my donor record, and I'll pick donor number 1. There's no relations at the moment, so if I click on that, I can say add edit relationship. I can say is the sponsor of, oops, what happened there? Okay, I'm a little baffled. I'm not sure where that went to. So I'm guessing that hero's not there. Oh, okay, maybe I didn't save the sponsor one correctly. Looks like I'll have to go back and do that again. So donor descriptive codes, relationship. I'll just double check that it's not there. No, okay. So sponsor, hero. Okay, let's try that one more time. So bring up donor number 1, click on relations, add edit relationship is the, hopefully it's there this time, sponsor of, and I'll just say it's a sponsor of donor number 2, Basil Faulty, and it automatically will now put in that Basil Faulty is the hero of Johnny Be Good. Okay, so when I escape out of there, go into relations, you can now see that that relationship is there. When I go to that record, relations is in red, I go click on that and you can see that he is the hero of Mr. Johnny Be Good. Okay, so that's how you add relationship codes. Now, there are a number of other codes that we can go through. I think most of these actually do exist in the actual codes file. So often it's just a matter of knowing where you need to go to set up various codes, especially if somebody else has already set the system up for you and you've inherited their system. So to do that, the first one we're going to have a look at is the ledger code. Now, I should point out, by default, most codes are going to be 8 alphanumeric characters long. And so unless I tell you specifically the length, just assume that they're 8 characters. Now, in the case of the ledger code or chart of accounts code, we go to campaign setup. So if you've got the button set up here, you can do it. Otherwise, we can simply go to main menu, go into your system, fundraising, and then campaign setup. So here we have chart of accounts ledger code. Now, this is a little different to most in that, first of all, the code is up to 16 characters long. And then for each code that you create, you can tell it whether it's deductible, non-deductible, or GST exempt. So if I want to create a new one, I'll just call it ABCD. Description is test ledger code. The archive code, if we set that to a yes, it means that existing codes or existing records with that code can keep it, but you won't be able to use it from now on. And we did discuss this in the first of the webinars. Display in the pop-up list. So when you click on a drop-down list of ledger codes, do you want it to be displayed? I'll leave that as a yes. And then I'll say that it's deductible. If it's deductible or exempt, it will not calculate GST for that donation. If it's non-deductible, it will attract GST. And just to show you how long it is, if I put a really long number in and press enter, it says, sorry, too many characters, 16 characters only. So that's one way of finding out, oh, that's the maximum that I can use there. While we're in the campaign setup menu, we have the thank you letter code. Originally, this used to be two numeric digits between 1 and 99. Now, like most codes, it's up to 8 alphanumeric letters. And this obviously equates to the same as the letter code that gets used in the receipt. Now, the bank account codes is again one of those codes that is not in the codes file. So if I can have a look and see what I've got in my test system now, I've got quite a few. So I'll pick on main account. I'm going to press enter. So in this case, there's not many details. I don't have my merchant numbers, Visa numbers, or anything like that. But those are places where you can then set that information up for you. As you can see here, you can have quite a large number of different bank account codes, and these then get used when you're processing donations and also when you set up campaigns. Okay. Now, when we're on the donor record, we have the ability to put in a second address. Now, the second address allows you to have actually multiple different types of address records. So I'll see if we've got any on my system here. No, I don't. But here you could have things like home address, work address, holiday address. Or if you've got, say, a number of people at the one organization that you occasionally want to write to, you might have, say, a main contact with a company, but occasionally you may wish to address the CEO. You can then set up a CEO address type and put that person's name and address details in there. And when you do a mail out, you can then actually, if you want to, say, look, if we know the CEO, let's mail it to them instead of the standard person. So to set those codes up, what we need to do is we need to go back to our donor descriptive codes over here on the left, and we should have over here second address codes. Okay, so like everything else, nothing in there at the moment, but I could say CEO here, and I could say CEO contact details, something like that. And we've now added that to the list. And then you can put home address, and so forth. Another code that can be used is this contact codes. So when you make any form of contact with a donor, you can actually say, yes, I've made contact, and there can be different contact codes. Now, this one is different in that this is a single character. So at the moment on the system, I've got mail history, pledge, telephone, but it would be useful to set up one for email so that when you do an email out to people, you can actually record that on the system. There may be other forms of contact that you can have with them. One of the options that you have when you process your donations is that you can say, create a contact record when you send a receipt. So you might create one called R, and we'll call it receipt sent or something along those lines. Okay. Occupation codes, I don't know how many people actually use that, but you could say what their job was. Now over here where it says sport codes, corp stat codes, these are actually user codes. So on the donor record, we have 3 user codes. Here, this one is sport. This is what we know internally as user code, but somebody, or I guess me, has renamed it here. This corporate status over here is user code 2. And if I page down and bring up the second screen, we also have this user code 3 here, which at this stage hasn't been renamed. So all of those things are actually done on the housekeeping and donor descriptive codes menu. Pledge operator codes can be updated here, as can operator codes, staff codes, and pretty much anything on the donor record can be updated here. we also have this additional code menu over here. So when you go into this one, we can see some other codes there. Now, we've already had webinars on using the code pool, I believe, so I won't go into all of these, but this is where we set up the master code, the subcodes, and then the code 2 there. We'll come back to the code check report because that's a very useful tool for you just to see whether you've got any problems with your codes. Now, these highlighting colors here allow you to assign a color to an extra code. If I go back to my extra codes under Donor Descriptive Codes, we have this option down here for selecting a color, and that way you can actually highlight particular donors with particular extra codes so that when you bring those records up, you know, oh, there's something special about this. And we talked about that in the first of those 3 webinars. But in the additional codes menu is where we actually set up those colors. So when we go in here, we've got numbers 1 through to 5. So if I want to create a new color combination, I can just call it 6, press enter. And what we do here is we choose the color. Now, it's actually a combination of both the background and the foreground color that it will use. And so we can scroll through this list and say, oh, I really like yellow in the foreground, green in the background. So if I accept that, it puts the color there, and I just enter through that. And now that I've set that up, I can use that on my extra codes. Okay. Now, another one that we're going to have a look at is in memoriam type. Now, well, actually, yes. So I'll have a look at in memoriam type. Now, in the old days, going back maybe 5, 10 years ago, the in memoriams were only for use when somebody died. And you could say, don't send money, please. Oh, sorry, don't send flowers. Make a donation on behalf of such and such an organization. That's fine, but in the meantime, what we've done is we've actually expanded it so you can use it for gift in lieu. So you can have in memoriam types of birthday, wedding, anniversary, or anything like that. So if you want to set up a new one, you simply go to the in memoriam system, and then you've got these memoriam type codes. We have a look at those, and like any other code in the code file, it's all fairly straightforward. There's a code of up to 8 characters with a description, and that's pretty much it. Okay. Now, one thing that, well, there's a couple of things actually. I'll just go back to where we were earlier on, housekeeping, donor descriptive codes, and additional code. Now, this was covered in the original, the first of these webinars, but I just want to highlight again the add edit title codes because it is a soft coded field. It is one that you can actually add to on the fly, and if you start looking at them, you can start to see, but especially in this one, there's some really weird and wonderful things there because people have just added rubbish. So you may wish to go into here and delete these. Simply bring it up, Shift F6, and it's gone. I can then go and look at another one and go, yep, I don't want that, Shift F6. So I would advise you to go through it. It won't be a problem for any donor record that has any of those bogus codes. It'll still accept it. The problem is if that bogus code is still in the codes file, if someone else accidentally types that same bogus code, it will accept it without prompting them to add it, and therefore they would just assume that everything was fine when it's not. Okay, now the last one I'm going to have a look at is the archive reason, and this one is a little bit like title in that it is a soft-coded field. So when you actually decide you want to archive a donor, it's going to ask you what is the donor or what is the reason for doing it. So when we go in and we'll just go and archive a donor. So modify history archive donors. All I need to do is bring up a donor record. So I'll just choose my favorite number 1, Shift F6. I'm going to say A for archive. Oh, well, there's a problem. Let me try donor number 2. See if I can archive that person. Okay, so I'll try archiving. Okay, obviously got a problem with my file. This is a bit of a test database for me, so let me try to archive someone who's fairly recently added. Okay, so it's now asking for a reason for archiving, and if there are already some options in there, inactive testing. All right, I might say by request. So it's not already in that list, but I can now add it to the list and go, okay, that's been added. And now, from now on, I can archive people with an archive code of by request. So in order to actually edit those, what I need to do is go to the archive menu. So to get there, again, I go via main menu, webinar, fundraising, and then not the modify history archive, just the archive, and then add edit recent codes. So if I had a look at that and found there was something there that I didn't want, I could then actually delete that. Now I think by memory the archive code is like 20 characters, or might even be a little bit more than that. Okay, so again, if I want to remove that, I can just bring it up, Shift F6, and that is now gone. Okay, so that's the last of the codes that I'm going to mention. However, I'll quickly run through the check report, because in housekeeping, donor descriptive codes, and under additional codes menu, I've got this code check report. Now, if you find that some of these things are not on your menus, just let us know and we'll be able to add those for you. The code check report is going to go through pretty much all the records, or most of the records in the various files in Donman, and it will check to see if there are any records where the code doesn't exist. And I've run this earlier yesterday, and I know that there are definitely some codes that are missing. So therefore, those are things that you may not be able to necessarily pull up, say, in a selection report, because you can only select based on particular codes that actually exist. So in my donor file, so this is what we're looking at here, the category is actually the donor type. So I've got 2 records in there with no donor type at all. I've got 40 with a code of F, whatever that is, but of course F is no longer a valid code. 3 rubbish, 76 with S, whatever that is. We've got 5 for board. Oh, sorry, that's an extra code. So there are 5 people that have an extra code of board, but board is no longer a valid code. Source code, I've got 1 with a blank source code, 259 with these things. We can look at archive file, look at the same sort of thing there. There's obviously nothing, yes, archive, nothing up. Prospect file, there's nothing there, so I obviously don't have any records there. Codes in the donation file, so I've got 2 donations with an auxiliary code of 0, and that's it. Everything else seems to be okay. You can see donor type, they're all fine. Oh, well, these are all blank, sorry, because I deleted that blank, and that's why it's coming up with 54,000 errors. There's a lot of these here, there's no problems there. With my campaign file, looks like a lot of the letter codes, these are some of the original ones, have been deleted, and so there's quite a few errors along the line there. And so I would advise you just to run that. Obviously, it'll take a lot longer to run on your system because you'll have more records in there, hopefully, but it's a worthwhile one just to make sure that all of the codes in all of your files are actually being used. Now, I did actually create a little spreadsheet, see if I can find that as a PDF here. It's probably a little bit small for you, so I apologize for that. But essentially what this is a list of pretty much all of the codes on the system, where you can actually go to find those. So for address, the second address type, it's got a length of 8, and you go to the additional codes menu under donor descriptive codes. Chart of account codes, as we saw before in the campaign setup menu, function codes, etc., etc. I did actually put this on to here. I've put it on Dropbox. It's probably not the best way to get it to you, but if you want to grab that web address there while we're perhaps addressing some of the questions, you can then download that yourself if ever you sort of lose track of where to find a particular code and where to update it. So I'll pass now back to Marla in case there are any questions.
Thanks, Murray. So as we mentioned at the start of the session, if you joined a bit late, if you do have any questions, now is the time to ask them. You just need to open the control panel to the right of your viewer window, type your question in the box provided and click on send, and I will read them out. So there was one earlier, Murray, from Claire. She said, can you supply relationship codes, upload instructions for a file of, say, 500 supporters?
As in, well, okay, I presume by that we mean that can we set up the relation codes in, well, not the actual codes, but the relationship records themselves between donor records? The answer would be yes, but what you would need to do is you would need to know the donor numbers of each of the two parties involved. And when you set up a relationship record, you have to have in the relationship record the primary relationship and the reverse relationship, and then you actually have to double that up in reverse order. So if I'm relating donor number 1 to donor number 2 as hero and sponsor, there would need to be two relationship records. One would say that 1 is the sponsor of donor number 2 and the reverse is hero, and one would say donor number 2 is the hero of number 1 and the reverse is sponsorship. So you would effectively have to have two records for every relationship that you want. And in each record, you have the both donor numbers and both relationship records, but they sort of have to be swapped around so that you get the reverse relationship entered.
Okay, a question from Nima. Can you advise how to get the code check report?
Okay, if you don't already have it, just log a support request and we can add it to your menu. It should be on your donor descriptive codes menu. Then you go to additional codes menu, and that's where it would normally be. But if it's not there, we can help you add that.
Okay, and also from Susie, we don't have the add edit title codes in our additional codes menu.
Yeah.
How do we add it?
Right. If you can just log a quick support request for that, I can sort of help you do that fairly easily. That is one that often doesn't seem to have come through automatically for one reason or another. So yeah, we can help you add that. It's basically a 2 or 3 minute phone call by me, and I can get you and show you how to add that.
Right. Okay, that looks to be all the questions, so we might start wrapping it up and just give everybody a couple more moments if they've got any questions. Just a quick reminder that recordings of our webcasts are on our website. You can go to donman.net.au under resources and go to recorded webcasts, or you can go via the tech support client support portal and you'll find them under the videos tab there. Now also our next webcast is on basic VisRep reporting, and it'll be on Tuesday the 10th of October, and it'll be at 2 p.m. and that's Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So for our clients in Perth and Brisbane, it's a time change for you particularly, well, because you don't have daylight savings. So 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time on Tuesday the 10th of October, and it's basic VisRep reporting. That's on our website now. You can register right now for that one. That looks like there's no more questions, Murray, so we will wrap it up there. Thank you, Murray, for today's webcast and doing it solo today because Gary's away. You will find, and I think I've gone through everything. Yes, so recordings are on our website. Details of our next webcast are on the website as well, and we look forward to seeing you next month. So thank you again for taking time out today. Goodbye for now.
Okay, bye from me.